welcome you to this webinar, part of London Climate Action Week. It's the official launch of the Financing the Just Transition Alliance, and I can see many Alliance members on the call and many friends and people we've worked with in the past, so that's fantastic. The Alliance brings together 40 organisations who will be working together to show how financial institutions can support climate action with positive social impact. So before we kick off in detail, just some housekeeping, if I may. First, could you mute your mics if you haven't already, and also turn off your videos so we can just see the panelists and the speakers, if that's possible. That'd be very kind, thank you. We will obviously invite questions from you and look forward to your questions and comments. Please submit those in the chat function. There's some guidance in the chat function about how to do that. If you want to direct it to a particular individual, please do so. Thank you. So the event is being recorded, and the recording and also any of the slides that will be presented will be made available afterwards. Thanks very much. So if the last of you could just, last entrance, could just turn off the videos if you're not a speaker for the event, thank you, and you're mute, thanks very much. And I'll kick off. So the Just Transition, I think what is very clear is that this is seen to be crucial for a successful shift to a resilient net zero economy. As many of us will know, it's part of the Paris Agreement, really with the aim to ensure that the transition benefits workers and communities and other key stakeholders, such as consumers. We know the transition is a good news story for jobs and communities, many more jobs in a renewable energy efficient economy, and there's a huge potential for social progress. And we need to make sure that these green jobs provide decent work, and also ensure that we avoid stranded workers and stranded communities, just as investors are also concerned about stranded assets, and make sure in this process of change we leave no one behind. The Just Transition has been long advocated by trade unions and by civil society, and I think it's also now recognised as a priority by governments, by finance and by business. And the COVID crisis, I think, has only reinforced for us the imperative to make the race for net zero a way of creating jobs and reducing inequality and making sure we're not creating new injustices in the process. We've been working over the past years with a growing number of investors and banks who've recognized that supporting a just transition is their business too, and have started to take action. This has involved partnerships with a range of organizations, many of you on the line, with the Principles of Responsible Investment, with UK Finance, with the TEC, and many, many others. And we've done this together with other universities, notably with our partners in the place-based climate action network in Belfast, Edinburgh, and Leeds. And welcome to all of you who I can see on the call today. This new Financing Just Transition Alliance has been formed to translate this growing momentum into concrete steps in the run-up to COP26. And I'd like to extend my thanks to the 40 organisations that have joined as founding members, and also thank the Friends of Providence and 30 Percy Foundations for making all this possible. So today we have a great set of speakers who will bring to life the Alliance, and then in the discussion I think we can go into much more detail. So first we will have opening remarks from Elizabeth Corley. Elizabeth is the chair of the board of the Impact Investing Institute, and Elizabeth has a distinguished career in finance, notably as CEO of Alliance Global Investors. We've worked closely with Elizabeth as part of the team that designed the proposal for the UK to issue a Green Plus sovereign bond, one that delivers climate and social benefits. And the Chancellor, as you may have noticed, has committed to a series of green bonds in the coming year. Then we'll be followed by my colleague, Katerina Schwartz, who will give us a presentation on the why and the what of the Alliance, going into a bit more detail. And then we'll have a panel discussion, and we'll delve into a bit more detail with 3 leaders showing why the Just Transition is essential and what they're doing about it to deliver it. We'll first have Carlota Garcia-Manas, who is Senior Responsible Investment Analyst at Royal London Asset Management, and she'll be focusing, I think, particularly on the role of shareholder engagement. Then we'll have Rachel McEwen, Chief Sustainability Officer at SSE, the energy utility, who will give some insights into their new Just Transition plan, which is hot off the press and released yesterday. And then Rishi Madlani, who's head of sustainable finance and just transition at NatWest, will show why this is an agenda for banks. Then we'll have time for your questions and answers. As I say, please do include those in the chat. So without further ado, Elizabeth, if I can hand over to you to give some opening remarks and set the scene. Many thanks.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Nick, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you, Nick, for asking me to give some opening remarks. I'm going to do so by just briefly thinking about the year 2020, but only briefly because we're all living through it and we all know it. Then I want to talk a little bit about some of the myths that we've carried with us from the 20th century. It's remarkable. We're now in 2020, and yet the mindsets that condition a lot of our thinking still go back to the education and behaviours that we had decades before. And then maybe turn to some examples of where I can see real forward-looking 21st thinking going ahead. So Nick alluded to what an extraordinary year 2020 is. I think on the positive side, it's a year in which the urgency of the climate challenge has been much more broadly recognised across the world. We can see a recognition that it's not just around carbon, it's not just around energy, it's the whole question of what we're doing to our natural habitat and the sort of the use and destroy approach that we've had on an assumption that the world can continue to replenish itself, with biodiversity and whole system thinking starting to come in and undoubtedly will emerge as a theme before COP26 next year. The pandemic has shown just how vulnerable and how open to shocks our system is. We live in a world where we assume we're in control, where we can actually look after our own lives and build walls to keep out what we don't want. The reality is we're an interconnected system, an interconnected ecosystem, and the realization that we can't build walls high enough or lock doors enough to keep out things, I think, is a deep shock to the 21st century mindset. And it's not just because we have lockdowns, it's also the vulnerability and the lack of resilience in systems we have taken for granted. I mean, the pandemic has been dreadful in terms of the cost of human life, absolutely awful. But it's also completely shaken up lifestyles and freedoms that we took for granted and assumptions of the future that have been shaken. Now, we can look to a world through COVID, but we'll be living with COVID in many different forms for a long time. And I think it's because of that, on top of the realization of just how serious the climate situation is, that when we had tragic events earlier this year that led to the Black Lives Matter campaign, that the whole question of social justice became absolutely a boardroom discussion. And I sit on the boards of a number of companies as well as chairing the Impact Investing Institute. And I can assure you that in every single sector where I was involved in conversations, the conversation turned to, it has to be different this time. The confluence of all these activities has really shaken people. And I think historically, we're going to be judged by how we pivot during 2020 to what we do differently in 2021. Now, that's a big statement because actually, as human beings, we have a wonderful ability to revert to what we used to do and to comfort areas. And what we believe in as good intentions, all the behavioral psychologists and behavioral economists will tell you, we have a reversion bias in how we behave. So it's very, very important that in this period of turmoil, uncertainty, and realization, that we actually capture the good intentions and turn them into actions, as Nick said. And I think that's why the launch of the Alliance today is so important. This is our way of making a pledge and commitment into the future that is being shaped by the realities of our present day. So that's why we're very pleased in the Institute to work with the Grantham Institute, with Nick, and be part of the Just Transition Alliance. I think it was the New York Times that said in the 20th century that history, when it judges, is not fair, it is just. And I think it's all up to us now to think about how we can make this a genuine and just transition to a net zero emissions. And of course, everything that stands behind that phrase, because we now know that it's much, much more than energy, although energy remains a pressing and urgent demand. So let's think about some of the myths that we've carried with us into this century that frankly are old and should be discarded. I don't believe in throwing things away. I think we should have a circular economy and we should recycle as much as we can. But these are things I really, really like to not recycle. The first myth we should really think about, and I think is being shaped by great work that's been done by McKinsey and others, is that GDP growth is somehow absolutely linked, locked in lockstep with energy consumption. And obviously that's partly population growth, it's partly lifestyle change. But I think increasing work's being done to show that energy efficiency, energy effectiveness, the role of electricity, hydrogen and other renewables is showing that we do not have to move in lockstep. The myth that we have to trade economic growth and prosperity for energy consumption is finally being shaken. And it's being shaken in a way which is creating a whole new set of commercial opportunities. As the ex-governor Mark Carney said last week in the Green Horizon Summit, this is the opportunity of a lifetime. But we have to really think about what that means and hold true to it, because there is still a risk that we think, particularly as we come out of the pandemic, that there is going to be trade-off activity between pace and nature of economic growth and the quality of that growth in a sustainable energy consumption way. That's really important. We need to remember what we've learned. I think the second myth that I'd like to bust is that there's a trade-off, and this is particularly true in the financial world, particularly true in investing, that there is a trade-off between values and value creation. Now, this has its roots in the fact that we all used to get used to ethical investing, socially responsible investing, where we made decisions not to go into a particular type of stock because for ethical reasons. And the prevailing assumption and the expertise in the investment industry was that any reduction in choice is a reduction in return opportunity. Actually, that is not true. It may be true if you make the wrong choices and you do it badly, but it is absolutely not true. And I think we'll hear more about that later when we get into the panel. The reality is there are value creation opportunities by thinking deeply about values. Why? Because capital markets, although they are emotionless, they are not immune from sentiment and trend. And the extent to which we see affected intangibles in capital markets is growing. Now, we're all used to seeing that in America with the S&P 500 and things like that, where we see the impact of the FANGs and other stocks having huge intangible valuations, which absolutely do not track through to financial results. But it's also true here in the UK. If there's work being done to look at the sort of the brand value and the reputation value in the FTSE 350, and it's been done year after year after year, and almost 40% of the gross market capitalization of the 350 comes back to brand valuations. And what is a brand? It's intangible. You can't measure it. Well, you could try and measure it, but you're measuring it based in the rearview mirror. It's not a predictor of future value. And if you look at the companies with the highest reputational component of their valuations, of the top 5, 3 are in energy or extractive industries. Now, those that are thinking forward about the cost that might be imputed to those industries for transition, for mitigation, and for moving away from fossil fuels will start to anticipate in those valuations the way in which it will go. The more those companies adapt, the better it will be. And we can hear already with the UK's commitment to mandatory disclosure on TCFD that this is going to become part of prudential regulation. It's going to become part of mandatory reporting. It will affect the valuations of companies. Now, I am not a believer in demonizing any sector. We cannot demonize because we rely hugely on energy in its current structures. We have to incentivize and encourage adaptation, mitigation, and alternatives. And that's partly where finance comes in. Another myth I want to bust is that there's a difference between financial and non-financial reporting. Now, we saw a very welcome consultation by the IFRS very recently on non-financial reporting. Now, that's a nice concept if you assume that all that matters is the dollars, the sterling, the yen, the euros that sit in the P&L or balance sheet. Unfortunately, we know because of intangibles, because of reputation, because of future factors, that these so-called non-financial aspects are deeply financial when they come home to roost. And it's very interesting that the International Business Council of the World Economic Forum recognizes this, recognizes that these sustainability factors can have financial consequences. And their report came out in September 2020 with the concept of dynamic materiality. There'll be many on this call very familiar with single or double or even triple materiality, but dynamic materiality means that when we're thinking about future investments, future finance flows, future valuations, things will shift. The perimeter between what we count today and what we value tomorrow will shift. And the last myth I'd like to talk about is that pension funds have to price daily. And it's interesting that Andrew Bailey, as the governor of the Bank of England, only this week came out and talked about whether we should be revisiting some of our prudential regulation. That's partly solvency, but it's also practice. If you think about it, if you have a defined contribution scheme and you're saving for retirement, however many years that might be in the future, you may not realize that the platform that underpins that insists you have to be able to put a price on most of those assets every single day by 5 p.m. Now that is a myth, that by saving over 20, 30, 40 years, we need to know tomorrow what our portfolios are worth. So those are the things that I think are legacies that we can leave behind us. And what I'm looking forward to in the panel that's coming now and talking about what the Just Transition Alliance can really achieve is to think about what we can do. We've seen last week, the Chancellor of the Exchequer announced a Green Plus Gilt. And as Nick mentioned, we've worked very carefully with the Grantham Institute and the Green Finance Institute to show that even in a green gilt, a use of proceeds sovereign gilt, you can find the social element of that without any compromise to the green credentials of that bond. There are ways by thinking about green and social together that we absolutely can stimulate a significant just recovery in the United Kingdom and globally. So that's one thing that's being done by governments. Regulators are signaling very clearly that they wish to see an appropriate approach to financial valuations and prudential management of financial institutions. But increasingly, we're also seeing multi-stakeholder capitalism really influencing what boards have to think about and how boards direct their resources, their time and their energy. In the UK, we have Section 172, we have the FRC consultation on how future corporate reporting might shape up. This is going to put more pressure not to make trade-offs, to think holistically about the enterprise and the enterprise's responsibility to all stakeholders. So we have government, regulators, corporates thinking more broadly. And as one of the people writing in the report, Brian Moynihan of Bank of America Merrill Lynch said in the WEF report, investors expect us to be addressing social considerations as well as financial considerations. That's a very powerful statement. And that came out in September from an American headquartered company. So we have the finance system also moving forward. And if we were in any doubt, consumers today and future consumers tomorrow will be expecting this of how we work and how we behave. There's a big question in my mind about the extent to which we can work holistically across the historic silos, get rid of those myths and work together, and whether we're thinking about stakeholders at a community level, an employment level with good jobs and decent prospects and continuing reskilling, or whether we're thinking about customers. I absolutely believe that the Just Transition Alliance has a very, very important role to play by bringing people together to think across our chains of value and create future value for future generations. And then when history judges us, hopefully it will be a just judgment. Thank you very much.
Elizabeth, thank you. That's really wonderful. And I just, my mind was caught up with this idea of this myth recycling machine, that maybe that would be a good job creator with decent work. So thank you very much. I think you really should put it in strategic context. I'd like to now hand over to you, Katerina, my colleague, and maybe just to run through in a little bit more detail the Alliance itself. So over to you, Katerina.
Thank you very much, Nick, and good evening. So again, my name is Katerina Schwartz. I'm a policy fellow in sustainable finance at the LSE. And together with the GRI team, I will be coordinating the Alliance over the next couple of months. The key area of our interest will be financing the just transition, which is critical to the successful climate policy. And actually, COVID crisis has emphasized the need for this. Banks and investors recognize the need to include the social dimension in their climate strategies for the benefit of workers and communities. Indeed, our alliance gathers 40 members wanting to translate their commitments to just transition into a real world impact. The alliance will tackle 3 key priorities, which are place-based finance, as well as corporate and national level actions. We will work on those issues and aim to present our findings at the COP next year in Glasgow. Just transition is a strategic imperative for the UK, and this has been emphasized by the Committee on Climate Change. What does it actually mean? So first of all, it means maximizing the social benefits of the transition. So it's not only new jobs, it's also high quality, new green jobs. It's mitigating social risks, for example, avoiding stranded workers and stranded communities. It also means empowering those mostly affected by the change. So not only workers, but for example, also the young. Anticipating future shifts to address issues up front. And in fact, the COVID crisis has in a way created an opportunity to do just that. Finally, it means mobilizing investment, which is what this alliance is about. Indeed, financial institutions are starting to move. More than 30 funds in the UK and 160 globally have committed to just transition, as well as 8 banks, social finance organizations, fintechs, foundations, networks, as well as cities associated in the place-based finance climate action network and committed to fighting climate change, such as Edinburgh, Belfast, and Leeds. We have worked with these stakeholders over the past few months and identified the objectives of our alliance, which will be to deepen the implementations of recommendations that we have talked about in our previous work for banks and investors. We would like to identify concrete steps to finance climate action with positive social impact, but also to experiment developing prototypes that can then be taken to scale and profile those promising examples and share lessons learned with others. The Alliance is really 40 institutions that have signed up to work with us on achieving these objectives, and amongst them funds and other investors, banks, development institutions, institutes, social finance organizations, as well as local climate commissions like the ones from Edinburgh, Leeds, and Belfast that I mentioned. What brings them together is being committed to just transition. In the work we've done with investors and banks in previous years, the following 3 dimensions have transpired, and we would like to focus on them over the next couple of months. These are place-based, corporate, and national. So, for example, we would like to explore how municipal, corporate, and indeed following the Chancellor's announcement last week, sovereign green bonds can drive just transition in the UK. We will analyze what corporations can do in terms of their strategies and the government in terms of its policy to facilitate delivery of just transition and its objectives. This could be done through shareholder engagement, but also through, for example, establishment of a national investment bank with a clear sustainability mandate. Over the next months, GRI will work with the Alliance members. We will be providing research and analysis. We'll be helping gather necessary intelligence to develop prototypes and scale up promising innovations. And we would like to present our recommendations and the fruit of our work ahead of COP26 next year. So with this, thank you very much. I would really encourage you to take a look at our website and our materials that we've produced over the past few months. And with this, I'll hand over back to you, Nick, for the panel discussion.
That's wonderful. Thanks very much, and I'm sure we'll have lots of questions. I mean, I can see that there are a lot of the members on the line today, so it's really good to have everyone here. So as I said, we got three leaders who will look into a little bit more detail what it means as an investor, as a business, and as a bank. So we'll turn to you, Carlota, if I may, from Royal London Asset Management, and Katerina, I think you're going to put up a slide to illustrate Carlota's words. So Carlota, over to you. Welcome.
Hello, thank you very much, Nick, and very inspiring presentation as well from Elizabeth. I work for Royal London Asset Management. I lead on engagement, set up the engagement plan for Royal London Asset Management, and I also lead on our climate strategy. The just transition was of interest to me academically. As background, I'm an environmental economist, and I have focused over the last couple of years in evaluation of the environmental externalities associated with the economic development. As the world progressed, a strategy embodied in the Paris Agreement of addressing those externalities through the pursuit of a low carbon pathway, an additional inefficiency could become apparent, the social one. Carbon emissions are a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution. The change to a clean future could have the unintended consequences of leave many behind. We've seen this encapsulated in the EU taxonomy DNSH, or do no significant harm, by which when an activity seeks to enhance a particular ESG consideration, it has to make sure it does not negatively impact another. Let me give you a couple of examples of this in the social context. So the photo that you see there is, as some of you, and seriously excuse my French pronunciation, the gilets jaunes, or yellow vests, actually excuse my British pronunciation as well, was a movement that began in France in 2018 and was initially motivated by rising fuel prices and a high cost of living. The movement claimed that a disproportionate burden of the government's tax reforms were falling on the working and middle classes. Other pockets of social unrest that we have observed over the last few years have happened in other places. Some are directly or indirectly linked to the impact of decarbonization. For example, we saw the civil unrest experienced in 2019 in Chile due to increases in public transport costs, which were partly produced by the cost of electrification of the fleet. And that, as we know, made that COP25, instead of taking place in Chile, actually took place in Madrid. Other ways in which this social friction arises that we have observed as investors is in the resource-dependent countries, where the impact of potential job losses or the disappearance of royalties associated, for example, with the closure of coal mines, decelerates the potential for climate policies to flourish. And we've observed that in many countries like South Africa or Australia. So what are we doing about all of this? In our engagement strategy, the first step that we take is evaluate our engagement priorities against our assets. And when we look at our portfolio, the utilities is a sector of exposure throughout our asset classes. We're members of Climate Action 100+ and the IGCC, the Institutional Investor Group for Climate Change, and we do collaborative engagement through these two platforms. Both initiatives integrate the recommendations from TCFD into engagement with companies. And as some of you will know, this focused on climate governance, risk management, and disclosure. And we have engaged extensively and vigorously over the years with companies in the utilities sector. In the context of climate action and IGCC, the just transition, as we've discussed, it appears in the Paris Agreement, it appears in the UK Green Strategy. And on top of that, considering just transition in the policy context and then integrated into the collaborative engagement, we wanted to give it additional emphasis, as Royal London Asset Management has a tradition and a heritage as a mutual. So with this in mind, we decided to join the Just Transition Initiative in 2019 to further embed social considerations into our energy transition engagement. So we have, as I said, engaged very widely with utilities, particularly in the UK. And in this engagement, we build a very close understanding of their own concerns about particular regions in the UK. One of the utilities firm in the distribution segment that we spoke with last year confided that 80% of their customers in certain regions were unwilling or unable to pay their utilities bills. When we discussed decarbonization strategies, including home refurbishment, insulations, investment in new, more efficient boilers, it became apparent the social component of the decarbonization must be considered by governments, by companies, and by ourselves, the investors, to remove any potential friction to a fast and fair transition. So just to conclude, the outcome of our engagement is to decarbonize the energy system, but doing that while supporting companies that are best prepared for the decentralization of the grid, and have engaged with both their employees for reskilling when this is needed, and their customers and the communities they serve. Thank you.
Carlota, thanks so much. And it was really interesting just to hear about how the Just Transition, I think, fitted with your sort of identity as a mutual provider of investment products for people across the country. Thanks so much for that. And thanks for sort of saying why it's such an important point around investor engagement. And I'd like to move quickly on actually to you, Rachel McEwen, Chief Sustainability Officer at Scottish and Southern SSE. Because I think you have been involved in dialogue with your investors, and they had brought up this issue of just transition. And yesterday you released your strategy, which I think is a world first. So Rachel, over to you, and really good to hear from you about, sort of, again, why this is so important for you, and then go through the principles you've set out in these areas. So Rachel, the floor is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you for having us today. SSE, UK headquartered FTSE 30 company, and we're focused solely on the markets of the UK and Ireland. And I would describe us as being halfway through our transition to net zero, not necessarily in terms of the time taken, but certainly in terms of the reduction in our carbon emissions. And 10 years ago, we were an electricity generator that was 1/3 coal, 1/3 gas, and 1/3 renewables. Now we have no coal, and we are reaching 50-50 gas and renewables, and we have Paris-aligned science-based targets on the route to zero. And I guess the point I'm making is that we aren't starting with a blank sheet of paper. We are transitioning from one thing into another. And arguably, it's the next half of the journey that represents an even greater transformation. And we all know from history that transformations can bring about, if we're not super smart, social injustice. Now, we published our Just Transition strategy yesterday, and the catalyst for this was what I think you might describe as textbook investor engagement. So Royal London Asset Management, Carlota and others, as well as Friends Provident Foundation, asked us at our AGM to publish a Just Transition strategy. Now that wasn't a surprise to us because they gave us notice, and it meant that we were able to give a fulsome response. And then since the summer, we've continued to engage as we developed our thinking. And we're very grateful to them for both the encouragement and the support for the statement published. But at the core of this strategy is 20 principles to guide us in supporting a just transition. And we've framed our thinking into two themes. The notion that we are transitioning into something new and green at the same time as exiting out of high carbon activity. And we deliberately put the transitioning in first because we believe this is where SSE's most material impacts now lie. We're investing £7.5 billion in 5 years into low carbon energy infrastructure, and that creates significant opportunity for economic prosperity. But there must be standards, safeguards and principles that govern the nature of that new that is being created. So in terms of the jobs created, there are basic standards such as a real living wage, but also the idea that decent work means continued learning and the opportunity for progression. But there's also a nod to the notion that what went before was not necessarily social utopia. This industry must be more diverse, both in gender terms and with Black, Asian and ethnic minority participants. The second pillar is about consumers. And when you think of the consumer, the multitude of opportunity that can arise for injustice can be overwhelming. But from a company perspective, our electricity networks businesses can help make sure that difficult issues like how can we guarantee universal access to smart electricity systems and who pays for what and when, that these things are properly considered by regulators, policymakers, governments and companies. The third pillar is also important. The ability to share the economic value with local places is a key element of a just transition. SSE's wind farm community benefit funds are now of really significant scale. Probably about £250 million will be given to communities over the lifetime of the wind farms. But actually, the most important area of all is the creation of an indigenous manufacturing sector that can supply the components for offshore wind farms. We say quite a bit about this in the strategy because this has not been plain sailing. Then within the second theme, which is where as a company, we are transitioning out of high carbon activity. And the first principle is deliberately designed to say that while high carbon assets do not have a long-term future, we are seeking to repurpose those assets for the net zero world. Gas plants located in places of strategic importance to the energy system are valuable to society, and they're also valuable to our shareholders, but as are the skills and knowledge of that workforce. But where there is no option in the longer term, we make commitments to our workforce to give notice, to work with trade union representatives, and to always prioritise redeployment and training first. And then the last pillar is to respect the role of communities. Certainly, when the coal stations come to the end of their lives, it is very apparent that there is a pride for the social and industrial heritage of these sites. They have provided livelihoods for 50 years or more and can dominate the local landscape. We must, as a company, but also the industry, must respect that legacy and consider those communities as primary stakeholders in our plans. So there's one last point I'd like to make. This strategy is simply a set of considered principles to guide us, but that's not the same as an action plan. We already know our immediate priorities, which is to help do what we can alongside others to build the supply chain, but also to consider the distributional aspects of the smart electricity systems. And we'll report against those priorities and other emerging ones in our sustainability report annually. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks very much, and I think it's a really interesting, good framework. I think that sort of phrase you've developed, transitioning in and transitioning out, is very helpful to sort of look at those. And then I think in terms of the sort of the key people involved, obviously your workers, communities, but also consumers. And I think going back to your presentation, Carlota, in a sense, the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vests protest was a sort of consumer protest against a carbon tax, which hadn't been particularly well designed. So I'm sure we'll come back to that, Rachel, and go into more detail about some of these issues. But thanks very much. Rishi Madlani, it'd be very good to hear from you now from NatWest. We've talked a little bit about the sort of investor dimension, the relationship between investors and businesses they invest in. But it'd be very good to hear from you as a bank, and obviously serving different parts of the economy, different regions, but also very different types of customers and clients, individuals, households, small businesses, large businesses, governments, and so on. So Rishi, over to you.
Thanks, Nick, and it's a delight to be back at the LSE, albeit virtually this month, as my alma mater, and to see the excellent work going on at the Grantham, but also the incredible sustainability strategy being set out there. So my day job is at the NatWest Group, leading sustainable finance, and my night job, as I call it, is as a councillor in Camden, not far up the road from the LSE. And I serve on the Cultural Environment Committee, and I chair our Pensions Committee. So just transition elements come into sort of pretty much a lot of everything I do and think around every day. So my first comment would be that we're on a journey on this, and what I hope to do in the next 5 minutes is give you a few of our initial thoughts and ideas about where we think this comes into our climate strategy. I'm very envious of Rachel's excellently articulated SSE's just transition strategy, and full credit to SSE for being the first out there with one, which I hope this will help move the piece move on. So the slide I've got there is it was when we our new strategy and the climate aspect of this. So our new CEO set out a new purpose-led direction for the bank back in February, where we champion potential, helping people, families, and businesses to thrive. Now, the reason I reference that is because after February, obviously, we all know a pandemic hit, and actually everything we did and do became influenced by what is something that's inherently a social issue that has changed the behaviours of everything we do. Whether that's the 10 billion of lending through government schemes, 260,000 customers, or the 330,000. I find this amazing. My colleagues have made these checks on customers and their welfare, or the 2 million in cash to vulnerable customers who couldn't access ATMs. So social has suddenly hit everything we're doing and how we do things. So this is a real. So the timing of this launch and actually the consideration of just transition is critical. And the other key, and I like to joke about this, is that previously, 5 years ago, my slides would have started with a climate change is real and happening now. And now I'm changing that around to having these are the social impacts and these are the just transition impacts of the climate decisions you're making as I go around the bank, as I work internally with our teams across the bank. And I think that's critical. We have hit a tipping point, and it's now time to move on from defending the science into moving into the piece. So when we set out our strategy, we like many, we have sort of the three main pillars: the halving the impact of our financing activity by 2030, which is broadly Paris alignment. This for me ties in very closely with the sector-based approach outlined in some of the just transition work, whether it's Rachel's world in energy, which is I think ahead of the curve, or where Nick and I brought just transition to the Renewable UK board, where energy companies are realizing that this transition will change the jobs and natures of what they do, and they're ahead of the curve on this, probably because the energy sector is ahead of the curve, is ahead on some of these. But as a bank, it would not be rocket science to figure out that a large chunk of our exposure is on mortgages or on real estate, similarly on transport. So our challenge on that, as we try and halve the emissions, is to how to mitigate those impacts. Now, whether it will be the government's Green Home Grant scheme or our own responses to that, our green mortgages, how do we adapt and make sure who gets left behind? In mortgages, it's the case that our products might reach certain, might have certain customer coverage, but can we have a bigger impact through our social housing book or our council book, where we actually already are large lenders to these sectors, and can we do more to bring other homes up to speed? Similarly on transport, we talk a lot about Teslas of the world get a lot of attention. How do we bring that focus to the Nissan Leaf and to other models that are affordable, and think around what are the schemes to help those access that? Is that my role in supporting bus transition and the transfer and financing of electric buses and hybrid buses and hydrogen buses? And that's where I think we go. And then the exciting bit that gets the most focus really is the championing climate solutions. So thinking about what are these products, and I think as we design these products, we need to really think, and challenge to my financial sector peers here is actually, are we considering the social impact? We're now learning to think about the climate impact. We have no choice. Our regulators are making us so. And I think many of us are now on that journey to be embedding this into everything we do. But are we really thinking through the social impacts of this? We've had to, during COVID, to think around the social impacts. And now I think we need to apply that through that. Final point I just want to make is around place-based action and how that fits in. As financial institutions, we all have impact and connections way beyond the initial areas of where our offices are. And given we're all working virtually at the moment, whether it's relations through sector groups, through London First, for example, SWEEP, the South West Environmental and Economic Partnership, or through West Midlands Mayoralties, there is a lot of opportunity for us as organisations to really work closely in that convening power that we have to really help find climate-based solutions. And I'll give one real example that really resonated with me. And Nick mentioned Belfast earlier, but we've been, Ulster Bank is one of our banks. And when I was out there doing some work on sustainability with some leaders there, we discovered that the major blocker to some of the climate action there was getting the sewer system in Belfast upgraded. That would mean that you didn't need to build more houses that were becoming derelict. Now, being taken out of use. Now, I don't think someone sat with all due respect, the towers of the Grantham Institute would realise that the sewer was necessarily the most obvious climate action required in Belfast. And this is that work and detailed thinking that needs to happen. The Scots are ahead of us. The Just Transition Commission in Scotland is doing some great work and some really excellent initial findings. And I think we need to think around what are those sector-based, local, sector-based and place-based actions. So in summary, I'll just sort of end with 3 points I want to end with. And I appreciate today we're preaching to the converted. By definition, we're the people who care about this stuff. And that's the one thing that resonates for me, is that how do we get out to the others? As my CEO puts it, tackling climate change and just transition will be a team sport. Collaboration is key. Today we're speaking to the people who are already advanced. You get it, you're here. The second point I make is the impact of social has never been more important. Whether that's our responses to COVID or what's happening with unemployment, in my own ward, we're up at 250% higher unemployment than we had last year. But I'll end with the last point is a reasons for optimism, from whether it's across the pond or the fact that we're moving in the right direction. I'm sure we'll get some questions about the 10-point plans. I won't preempt that, but think about not just what we do, but the impact of our assets under management and our balance sheets. We really can tackle these problems and bring a social aspect to climate.
Well, thanks, Rishi, and thanks particularly, I think, the emphasis on this being a team sport. So I'm going to just ask a few sort of follow-up questions to the panel. So really, this is the opportunity to you as the audience participants in this to think about your questions and what you would like to ask the panelists. But maybe if I could sort of talk to you, Carlota, and also Rachel. Rachel, very good to see your strategy coming out, as you say, a set of 20 principles, fairly comprehensive. And also, Carlota, you've been working in this shareholder engagement relationship. Where do both of you see this happening across the utility sector, which obviously is a sort of cornerstone sector for the transition? Do we see this is going to lead to greater uptake of the just transition as a core essential element? Maybe Rachel, maybe to you first.
Yes, in terms of our peers in the UK, while it might not be sort of articulated as just transition, you can see through price controls in distribution gas and also what's coming through in distribution, you can see some of these concepts of equity and a big focus on ensuring that people aren't left behind from the electricity systems transformation that's going to happen. I mean, I sort of say that electricity distribution networks are going to be the killer app that allow us to bring about net zero at a local level, and the transformation that is going to happen there. You think that it's been a big deal, the big sort of move to renewables, but this is a much bigger deal. It will change the way in which we all interact with the electricity systems. So the opportunity for people to be left behind from that is really significant. Innovation and smart are not natural bedfellows of fairness. And you can see that many of the distribution network companies are already thinking about that. I mean, we did some work with Western Power Distribution and the Centre for Sustainable Energy on trying to predict who will be left behind, but then taking it on a level to look at the capabilities and capacities that people will need to have in order to engage properly with these smart electricity systems. Because once you're engaged in it, then a whole sort of whole world of wonder comes out of it, from being able to to manage your electricity demand and to get better prices because of that, and to be much more smart about the way in which you use energy. And those are opportunities, but the chances are it will be early adopters and people who can afford it that will get the chance. So I suppose what I'm trying to say in a very long-winded way is to say that the concepts might not be articulated like a just transition strategy, but they're definitely on it. And I suspect that some of our peers will probably do something similar quite quickly. Thanks very much. There's a thought there clearly that we will need to think about what are the sort of regulatory implications of just transition in sectors such as energy, which are clearly maybe other sectors, water and so on, and indeed potentially in the financial sector as well. So Carlota, obviously
You're focusing on a number of companies. Where do you see this sort of shareholder engagement going next, and also where do you think the alliance can play a role in sort of taking this forward?
Sure. So in practical terms, we published this week with the Friends Provident Foundation an investor expectation for energy utilities, kind of just transition strategies. You can find it published on both our website and by mistake, I think it's all the way to the top of the chat. So if people are interested, I think there is a URL at the very top of the chat. I was trying to share this with the panelists, but I think I share it with everybody. Basically, those are some principles, and we will continue our collaborative engagement along the lines of that document and use it in our next round of engagements. We acknowledge and do an evaluation of the different impacts and risks faced by the various actors and segments of the utility value chain, from generation and distribution to retail. So they face different risks, different impacts at different points of their strategy. The expectations document include recommendations for corporate engagement with their workforce, community, supply chain, and consumers. Resonates very much with Elizabeth's presentation about the whole value chain and working together. For example, we engage, or we recommend companies to engage early and in reskilling of the workforce and provision of good quality jobs in line with the International Labour Organization core conventions, or support for vulnerable customers through energy affordability, fuel poverty alleviation tests embedded in the energy transition strategies, and so that they take into consideration energy efficiency, heat decarbonization, but also equitable distribution of system transition costs. So that's kind of the immediate next step. Then the bigger picture next step is basically our joining the financing the Just Transition Alliance. We hope to contribute to this work, particularly with our utilities sector hat on, because we have this very long kind of history of engagement, and hopefully we can finding engagements kind of entry into the investment decision making. The other element that we have discussed is the potential for metrics in this area to be evaluated and designed. We know that metrics in the social areas sometimes are difficult to craft and to use, but I think social metrics still are important to do. So ultimately, just is our kind of optimistic outlook is that we think through properly policy intervention, engagement dialogue, and corporate action, the idea is we are able to remove that social friction and keep the core as a kind of healthy, prosperous, and clean future.
Great, thanks, Carlota. And I think we may touch on the question of metrics later. I mean, Rachel, you mentioned how you've set out your principles and you'll be using this as a framework for reporting. And clearly, this is an area where if you look at all the reporting frameworks, just transition is not really mentioned in the TCFD or these other frameworks. So I think actually sort of getting some consensus actually between companies, investors, and other stakeholders will be important there. I'd like to maybe touch on, sort of bring Elizabeth, you and Rishi in, and particularly talk about, I mean, investors and banks obviously can engage and they can set expectations, but they can also allocate capital. Elizabeth, you part of the team with us and the Green Finance Institute, which did put together this Green Plus model, which is essentially we're trying to say we need to do green and social at the simultaneously. So it'd be good to hear a little bit more, and may touch indeed on the metrics point, but about the potential that we could see as the sovereign bond to be a sort of a catalytic process, but also then Rishi, I mean, you at NatWest, you have yourself issued bonds, sustainable bonds, indeed social bonds. Again, you have metrics of that, but I'd be very interested to see sort of from both of you, maybe some of the sort of financial innovation which can help channel capital towards the just transition. So maybe start with you, Elizabeth, if I may.
Yeah, thank you. And you're absolutely right, Nick. We saw the the issuance of a green gilt in the UK very much as stimulating a broader corporate bond market as well, without doubt. And the work we did with yourselves and the Green Finance Institute to look at the green strategy the government has, to find projects and then to identify, you and Katerina did a great job of working with others in the team to identify the work that would actually generate social outcomes. And at the beginning of this work, there was a hypothesis out there, which was that green investors would not like this. There was a sort of sense, particularly from certain sell-side desks, that this would complicate the launch of the first ever green gilt, and it would be difficult, and it would not fit anybody's investment category. But actually, we engaged in think-ins with investors, as you know, and we tested this idea, and there's no dilution of the green credentials by linking social outcomes. There's absolutely no dilution of the green credentials, and this would be bought by green investors. The key thing is that it fits a normal benchmark, which is classic for any investor. So that was something that was very, very important, and to put that as a concrete, practical test. So in terms of the principle on a use of proceeds bond, that was fine. I think this will trickle down to the corporate issuance market. The practicality that comes with it is to, okay, and then how do you measure that? Particularly as some of the outcomes could well be over a significant time horizon, which is beyond the investment time horizon sometimes. So there, as we're now starting to talk with Nick and Katerina and others about how can we think about the evidencing of this in a simple way that doesn't mean that the measurement becomes such a burden nobody wants to do it. It's got to be practical, it's got to be linked to the real world, it's got to be linked to real life. And sometimes it's going to be around just as much around measurement and management as it is around outcome. Because we have to anticipate that the outcome could be very much in terms of future generations. And I think if we can get that sense of measurement, management linked to reporting, and then, okay, this is the outcome we're heading towards, test that with the market. We're using standard market principles, ICMA and other market principles. We hope that that could work in terms of the bond market, but there's no reason why the same language couldn't work in a financing market for bank lending, for example, that Rishi would be looking at, or if we can make it consistent with social bonds as well. But I think it's a very exciting area, and I can see a lot of interest in it emerging from the conversations we had with the buy side who want to own this debt.
Great, and Rishi, I mean, please jump in. But I was struck by looking at your social bond, and obviously other people are doing it as well. But also how that is a mechanism for channeling funding to SMEs, which often have been hard hit in COVID, and obviously are a key player in the transition. So it'd be interesting to see about what you see as some of the mechanisms.
Yeah, happily, Nick, and I'll touch a little bit on the detail of that, and then actually how that ties in and how I see that flowing through to the Green Plus Gilt, because when we first set about our journey on creating our green, social, and sustainable bond framework, being someone who worked on climate and worked in project finance for many years, I was like, oh, it's easy. Let's start on the green stuff. We kind of understand the measures. And I was really glad to be challenged by my Treasury team to think of, okay, let's try and push the boundaries in this. We're an important issuer in the UK, and we actually can help push that thinking on this. So we were challenged to think about social. And what I was shocked about was there was no social deprivation index for the UK that was UK-wide. So we actually had to create our own index, which I found kind of bizarre. I was like, as an LSE economist by training, I was like, surely this must already exist. How are we having to discover this? Furthermore, then once we mapped that to identify the assets to go in, which are in the most deprived regions in the UK, we then had to create a jobs measure. And the best measure of this, and I'm sure the Scots will appreciate this, was the Scottish Government input-output table, which was the best way to equate jobs. Now, this is by far from perfect. I will not say that our social bond is perfect, because it gives us an interaction of the jobs. That does not tell us how good quality those jobs are, does not tell us the precariousness of jobs. And this is the point I want to make that's wider, is that on climate, we're beginning to understand the measures and metrics, as building on Elizabeth's points so articulately made, is that we need to now understand what the language of social finance will be. And we're nowhere near that yet, to be brutally honest. We can barely define what is intrinsically social. There is no proper definitions of that clearly. And the interesting part is it varies across Europe, because actually social finance will be different in Netherlands versus France, because we run our social service in different ways, and what we define as social is different. And there's a lot of work to be done in this. So people like me will be busy, don't get me wrong. But I think the key thing that I want to come back to is back in the day when I was the bank's rep to ICMA on the green bond principles, back then it wasn't a very popular thing. It was more like a church disco than a thriving nightclub that it is now. I think it was interesting to see that I would have been skeptical about a green sovereign bond back then, because I would have thought it was bankers trying to make some more money. But actually seeing the impact of what this does across the economy, what this did in France, SNCF, the impact it had on other industries, and similar, we're seeing some of that multiplier effects through. It's not quite the same, but TfL, and what this could run through. And with my local authority hat on, when we're desperate to create jobs, this is the chance really to change our economy for the better and turn the sort of words of the Prime Minister into action.
And maybe, Nick, if I could build on that, and then it goes back to Carlota and Rachel, because that is a brilliant. You can't just measure; it's also about engagement. It's about the stewards of capital engaging with the users of capital. And if we try and all get it down to a single black and white 1 or 2 dimensional measure, the point that Rishi just made so well will be that we're measuring stuff, but we don't know the consequence of what we're measuring without engagement. And I mean, that's very much what came out of the SSE and Royal London example that we heard just a minute ago, that good stuff comes from productive engagement. Yeah.
Great. Thanks for people sending in questions. It's starting to flow now, so obviously your juices are flowing, so thanks very much. A question, I think, probably to you, Rachel, from Matthew Crichton, which is really about what does the panelists say to trade unions in Scotland, who see that there's all the rhetoric of British transition and government and so on, but actually it doesn't really mean anything in terms of actually protecting jobs. The case about jobs being lost at BIFAB, a yard, and also the green buses in the case of Alexander Dennis. I mean, I think you were alluding to that in your opening remarks. Maybe you could say a little bit about that, sort of actually the local job creation potential of that, and also sort of that whole question of supply chain and procurement.
There's a few levels to this. Sorry, a few levels to this. I think the first thing to say is that we, Rishi, referencing the input-output models of Scotland, we use them a lot, it's fair to say. So we quantify and we look at the impact on jobs and GDP for all our major projects. So I'm going to give you an example. Beatrice offshore wind farm, which was opened last summer. At the time, it was the largest ever private investment in Scotland, and we did the whole life. So it was a £2.5 billion investment, and then of course the wind farm lasts for 25 years. The UK content of that entire lifetime was around about, I can't remember exactly, but it was around about 60%, maybe even a little bit higher. And what it told us is that the value and the jobs that are created over the long time, so around operations and maintenance, which is basically you can double the capex, if you know what I mean. So if the capex is £2.5 billion, then the cost of operations and maintenance will be double that. And what you find is it's over 70% in terms of UK content, but through the construction it is less, so you get to an average of around about 60%. Now, so that value comes from not just manufactured goods, it comes from service and works contracts as well. But the truth is that manufactured goods are not coming from UK markets, and the big question here is, why is that the case? Why is it that our supply chains in the UK and Scotland are not healthy, thriving or competitive to be able to provide developers like ourselves with the products, the goods that we're looking for? And of course there are big questions there around investment, about industrial strategy and other things that are beyond our direct influence. Nevertheless, there are excellent examples beyond CS Wind and BIFAB of where there have been suppliers that, so for example in Aberdeen, Petrofac and Subsea 7 are suppliers that have diversified from the offshore oil and gas industry to be able to provide services to the offshore renewables industry. And then Global Energy at NIG. So some of the success stories are not talked about, but I'm not wanting to belittle this, because the point is that the scale of what is going to be happening with offshore wind is literally awe-inspiring. So if you think we've got 10 gigawatts of offshore wind off the coast of the British Isles right now, seeking to have 40 gigawatts by 2030. Climate change committees, saying anything up to 100 gigawatts in UK waters by 2050. Now, if we can't produce a healthy, competitive, thriving indigenous manufacturing capacity to be able to supply that, then that's a problem for the country. We have to be able to do this because it will secure part of the just transition. It's not the only thing, but it is really, really important. And we have highlighted this in our strategy because I would say that we're frustrated that we've not been able to make more progress. There's lots of reasons for that, some good, some bad, but we do want to see progress, and we've got some suggestions for government to how they could do that.
Very good, Rachel. Thank you. And I think that, yeah, it's a big challenge for the UK, and obviously we need to see that happen. I see Bill Adams from Yorkshire and Humber TUC. Bill, do you just want to ask a question?
Statement really rather than a question, but I just wanted to say thanks for including us in this meeting. I think it's important that trade unions have a voice on this, on these issues. And I very much welcome Rachel's statement from SSE about how to, give workers reassurances about the next 20 or 30 years. And I think one of the things that I've been struggling with, because I've been calling for Just Transition Commission in Yorkshire now for 3 years. We've finally got round to establishing an independent commission from January 21, and I think there is heavy scepticism amongst workers and unions, really that's come about from the last 40 years, where workers have been made redundant, tossed on the on the tip, really, in terms of their livelihoods and jobs. Sometimes being made redundant by text message, all based on offshore in the manufacturing. So I understand where the worries come from, and I think statements like Rachel's SSE can only go to reassuring. And I'd like to call for a much wider statement from industry and finance about what's going to happen to people, and that trade unions will be involved, will have collective bargaining around the issues. Yes, there will be job losses, but on the positive side, there could be tens and hundreds of thousands of new jobs, and they need to be good new jobs, and they need to replace jobs that are disappearing in old areas. And in Yorkshire, we have areas of Yorkshire that have never recovered from the decimation of the mine and the steel. Other manufacturing disappearing, and someone from the LEP in Humberside I was talking to the other day, we're making the blades in Hull for offshore, but the stanchions are coming from Malaysia, and we have Scunthorpe Steelworks down the road under threat, which could be doing that job. So we want to see a lot more social partnership. We want to have a real interest in this in terms of negotiating skills and training plans for future employment. We need to talk about income security for people who are displaced. We need to talk about retraining and training schemes and what those jobs are going to do for those areas. So, signing the ITUC pledge would be a start, but, I'm not saying people need to do that, but certainly need to think about reassuring workers and unions that, things are going to work out in a way that's beneficial for everyone in terms of what we need to do for the economy. So, just wanted to get that out. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Bill. I think your room is even darker than mine, so I can just about see you. But it's really good to have you, and thanks for that. I mean, it'd be really interesting comments from the panel, and particularly about, I think, sort of Bill's point about how we bring these different communities together: business, trade unions, communities, and finance. Anybody wanted to follow in from what Bill's just said?
I could kick off because wearing my old hat, Bill, as a global CEO of an asset management company, I also ran the European business where collective workers representation was normal and actually was engaged. And we had to go through some very, very difficult resizing, restructuring in the wake of the financial crisis, for example, 2008-9. And what I found was that if there are long-term constructive relationships with the workers' representative bodies, and they were different in each country, France is different from, you'll know better than me, France is different from Italy, is different from Germany, etc. You actually were able to sit down around a table, and it was not confrontational, even if the problem was difficult, because the problem was actually going to mean that there were risks to livelihoods. And it was about having that normal dialogue in normal times from which you can then get into the more difficult times. So I think encouraging, and I think a lot of this does come down to regional dialogues, because the regional ecosystems are so different. The redeployment opportunities, the reskilling opportunities become local very quickly, as you know better than I do. All I can say is that really struck me as something that was very positive from my experience working abroad. I do think the Financial Reporting Council is trying to encourage UK boards to be much more engaged with their employees, much more thoughtful about listening, whether that's through formal representation or informal, but listening and being accountable for it. And I think that's absolutely spot on. I have a slight concern, which is that in terms of accounting treatment and incentivization, it's sometimes much easier to invest in IT or fire somebody than it is to think constructively and thoughtfully about reskilling, redeploying, or relocating. And I think there's something around the accounting community, Nick, that should be part of this alliance, to think about how we can more helpfully let even though I said finance isn't everything, the reality is it's a big driver of behaviours. And so if we could think about getting the accountants more involved in this, I can see Rachel nodding. It's sometimes easier for a CFO to do something, but they don't want to do, even if they're passionately against what they have to do, because the numbers just push them in that direction.
Great. I wanted to actually bring in a couple of other the members, if I may, who are making really interesting remarks. Faith Ward from Brunel. I don't know if you want to say a few words, but I mean, your point is, what about the ultimate capital allocators in the pension industry, asset owners, and so on? You mentioned the Local Authority Pension Funds Forum, which is a member of the association. But Faith, I don't know if you wanted to say a few words now about why this is important for you as a major pension plan. Putting you
thank you, Nick. Yeah, no, I wasn't expecting to speak, but no, I mean, as I kind of said in my note, I do see, given that we represent at Brunel sort of the pension strategy to local authorities, and I've been saying this to them, and they do seem to be, so I think we are seeing reference to the just transition in their policies as they're developing them. So yeah. I think maybe it's a natural step then to take that commitment one stage further, and so we'll be bringing it up for them. But obviously I can influence the behaviour of 10 clients, because that's the 10 partner funds that we work with, because I've kind of sold it as kind of, why wouldn't you? I mean, this is just, to me, it's just an absolute no-brainer, because I mean, they're local authorities. We're talking about employment. We're talking about climate change. I mean, these are just incredibly on their agenda. But I'm just worried that we just don't have. The coalition is brilliant, but it does need to have. We just need to engage more. I mean, we know this is a problem across all topics, about getting more asset owners directly engaged on the topic and not just relying on their asset managers or collective organisations like LAP. Right. But they just need to understand their role as capital allocators, not just good stewards in the kind of more traditional sense of stewardship, but actually the capital allocation content of stewardship, if you like. Mm-hmm. So it's more that it's probably fair to say that, as Rishi was saying, we're rather preaching to the converted, but we do need help to engage that wider community, because I think, as I say, hopefully it's a no-brainer. So it should be an easy one to get to, but perhaps we need to think about what's the communication strategy around that.
Great. No, that's a really important point, and I like that emphasis on the capital allocation point, and particularly, I mean, local authority pension funds have been, I think, very receptive of the strategic message, but I think maybe over the next year to sort of translate that into real decisions, that'd be great. The other person I wanted to bring in, if I may, was Bruce Davis at Abundance, who you've been leading this initiation of sort of new community municipal investments with local authorities, and you were sort of pointing to the question about the role of retail investors in this. I think maybe at the municipal level, which is where you've been leading, but also maybe at the sort of sovereign bond Green Plus area. So Bruce, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Thanks, very interesting. So far, all the different comments. I think it's really about, so within the community municipal investment, I guess we're discovering the impact of involving local citizens in the decision process around investing. I think what we're hearing is a lot of technical problems when you're looking at institutional level. When you're down at sort of local level, those become much more about practicalities of transition. And I think what we're seeing, and I was, actually there's focus groups happening right now, actually on my other channel, talking to people in Leeds about these, and you know what's coming up there is really that they see a lot of things on the surface happening in terms of transitioning to a different economy, and that's been almost highlighted more strongly by the impact of COVID actually. But that people just don't really understand the mechanisms. So they don't really understand what role local authorities could play, what role government plays, what role the private sector plays. And interestingly, investment is then a really interesting lens to make people view that. So rather than seeing this as simply a communication challenge and a behavior change challenge, actually, it's more about this engagement piece through people's money. And I think, you know, one of the real sort of benefits of that is that people start seeing money as part, rather than a sort of problem to be avoided, a risk to be avoided, it becomes a part of the solution. And then people start to look elsewhere in terms of where their money is. And then I think that helps those that are trying to influence pension funds and others to sort of reassure that this is something that people want. And it's not just in surveys, but actually in where they're putting their money. And I think the green gilt, the green plus gilt, is really right in the sweet spot, I think, for retail investors right now in terms of what they're looking for. And it would give, I think, a real signal back to the Treasury. We talk about market signals, but I think there's a signal back to the Treasury that what they're doing has popular support, it has political support. Mm-hmm. And then you can have a different conversation about what things can go in, because it's going to be in the public domain to a far greater extent than otherwise would be the case if it's simply going to be issued through, say, the more conventional mechanisms of the Debt Management Office. So I think this is where I think opening that up gives us opportunity to talk about the just transition in terms of the practicalities now. And I think that is the point where we're at, actually, is like, well, what are we going to do first? And that's been very powerful, actually, in West Berkshire, where we've done the first bond, and hopefully with the next ones coming through next year.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, sort of finance as a tool for communication. We've heard about the engagement between investors and a business in the Scottish, in the SSE case, but I think actually sort of both in the local level, maybe in the national level. I don't know, Elizabeth, any thoughts on green gilts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really great question, Bruce, and we're definitely going to look at it. We were pleased to see that the Chancellor committed to a series of green gilts, and the plus, he mentioned the plus element in that as it related to jobs, which we were very pleased about. Even if he didn't call it a green plus gilt, we didn't mind, because he had the job reference in there. And in fact, Nick and I were on a call only earlier this week, Nick, if you don't mind me mentioning it, where we were actually debating this whole point about when would you bring in retail interest? Yeah. Because is it with the first one? Because this is the first green gilt that is issued in the UK. So there's going to be quite a lot of sort of teething things to sort through. There's going to be practicalities to sort through. But absolutely, it's something we want to look at, how we could get an allocation for retail savers, whether that's direct into the gilt or whether it's through an ISA, for example, so that the financial intermediaries can package it into a low cost, high value ISA, I think would be great. But we're absolutely with you on that. Yeah.
One comment in passing, maybe to take another, I'm struck, Bruce, one of the community municipal investments that you've helped develop is in Warrington, actually, for their climate emergency. And when I was reading your Just Transition statement, obviously you've had Fiddler's Ferry in that area, Rachel, I think in the Warrington area. So here you have essentially a large high carbon facility, and the process you've gone through to look at that. And then here you have actually a local authority trying to move ahead on the climate emergency. And the thought just struck me whether you could use sort of creative financial instruments, drawing on people's savings in the area and elsewhere to actually bring new business and jobs and prosperity to that region. But that's a passing thought. I don't know if that's passing thought. We had one further question, which I thought was good, and I think we're getting some good feedback. One really about some of the innovation coming from smaller players as well as big players, and mention of community development finance institutions. I don't know if we have anybody from a community development finance institution on the call, but I think particularly when we're talking about the place-based elements, that dimension of bringing local financial institutions will be really really important. So we're coming near to the close. If anybody else has sort of urgent questions, but I want to sort of turn back really and thinking about the year ahead. We have, obviously, we're in the midst of a deep crisis. I think we have the beginnings of a sort of green recovery strategy coming in various phases from the government, more this week and much more to come, we hope. And it'd be really good to hear from the panel about how we sort of take a lot of these sort of good first steps and really scale them up in the next year, both in terms of the role of finance, the role of business, how that interacts with key stakeholders such as workers and communities, and indeed what it is that government should be doing to support a just transition. If I might start with you, Rachel, because as well as your very busy life, you're also on the Scottish Just Transition Commission, which is a process, multi-stakeholder process to advise the Scottish Government about how they make the process fair to all. So maybe your reflections on how we sort of build on these positive steps, and particularly what it is that you would be looking to both the Scottish Government, but also the UK Government to move ahead on the just transition.
Okay, it's quite a broad question. I'm going to try and focus on two things.
Yeah.
The first is what I've learned from being on the Scottish Just Transition Commission. We've taken evidence from many sectors, and one of the conclusions that we came to quite early is that the potential for injustices is increased if there is a disorderly transition to net zero. And COVID has impacted on making the disorderly element more likely. And you can look, if you just look at Scotland and the decline of the oil and gas industry. And that's probably the thing I'm most concerned about. So actually, there was another thing, which was when we were taking evidence from some sectors, I'll not mention them, but it was clear that some sectors, high carbon sectors, have absolutely, they are not on a trajectory towards net zero. And I wouldn't say that about oil and gas, that when you speak to the oil and gas industry, that they're very focused, but there are other high carbon ones that aren't. And that is deeply concerning because that will have major consequences in a disorderly manner. So that's probably one of the big things from a Just Transition Commission perspective, is that we really need to be orderly about this, and there need to be serious plans sector by sector. And government needs to provide leadership for that. In terms of specifically, I suppose, a more of a self-interested company perspective, I think that the 10-point action plan that came out yesterday is welcome. Any progress is good progress. Obviously, we could always complain about there being more. But in my own industry, we must get to 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. It is just absolutely critical that we pile in the renewable electricity into the system. And the run rate, the average length of time it takes to create one of these mega wind farms, it's probably about 10 to 12 years, and we simply don't have the time to do that. So I suppose our advocacy to government, which they're all ears, so I'm not criticizing, but if we do things the way we've been doing it, then it won't be enough. And the sort of sense of urgency and speed in the way in which we go about things has really got to accelerate. Those are my two things.
Fantastic. Thank you for making a very complex question very simple. So thanks for that. Carlota, please, your closing thoughts, please. Thank you.
Well, it's just a linkage between what Rachel just said and Faith's question and Claire's response to that kind of made me spark a certain thought. Last year, I helped our parent, Royal London, with their PRA stress test. And hearing Rachel about the disorderly transition and the potential greater social impact, maybe a route is really to ask regulators, the PRA, the Bank of England, to include in their stress testing not just climate transition and climate transition risk and physical risk, but social risk. Because that idea, Rachel, that you just mentioned kind of sparked on me that any value at risk has not taken into consideration the social component. So in answer to Faith's question, maybe that route of looking at regulators and try to integrate the metrics that we were talking about could be a solution.
I think that's a really interesting idea, and certainly in the work we did in the banking sector, which we partnered with UK Finance on, I think that was one of the thoughts that when we have the UK climate stress test, we will be able to see potentially at a national level where there are concentration risks. It's not just Bank A and Bank B, but actually there may be particular communities or regions. And so I think actually building on that, and that dimension will be very good. So to you, Rishi, your closing thoughts, how we sort of make the reality of a just transition in not just at NatWest, but throughout the banking sector?
Yeah, so I think actually data and information, that's key. I think TCFD disclosures this year will be key. Everyone's been learning, maturing, and if you look at them, the first ones, well, when you look back, I think in years to come, we'll laugh at the first attempts because they weren't perhaps as good as they could have been. But I think that will show more transparency of data. I thought that was actually the sort of hidden announcement last week that probably didn't get as much attention as it would because it's about reporting, but actually showing that transparently so investors and workers alike can see what firms are doing is going to be critical. We want to see this and see that it's being embedded, and I'd like to see TCFD get a green plus angle on it or get a jobs angle on it, because I think that might be a natural piece here. So you heard it here first. Let's send it to Mark Carney and get him on it.
Well, I think that the TCFD frameworks could certainly be incorporated, so you can incorporate workers' communities and so on. So I think that's a really good thought. And then Elizabeth, you started off with sort of how we need to leave behind the myths of the 20th century. Sort of your thoughts about this. I mean, clearly we are in a very critical situation. There's and what I find striking is, in a sense, institutions you wouldn't be expecting to be thinking about just transition, major banks, leading investors, businesses indeed, maybe as well. Sort of how do we really make this this next year sort of very serious in terms of delivering impact? Can't hear you, sorry.
You think by now I would be used to unmuting myself, wouldn't you? I think in the run-up to COP26, we do have an extraordinary opportunity because this is going to stay on government agenda and policy agenda and regulatory agenda. So I completely support what all the other panelists said about pace and direction and clarity. I think it's a very trite statement, but I don't think we should let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Just as Rishi said so well, we're going to look back in a couple of years and say, oh my gosh, did we really publish that with pride? You know, we're going to move on, but we need to get on and do things, learn by experimentation. I really think there's a scope to open source some of this, some of the best ideas. I congratulate SSE on going public with it. I mean, some people would have said, no, we're going to keep this secret because we can go a ta-da to our investors and do a big job. But I think there are certain things where we can showcase best practice and encourage others. A very practical suggestion, I think the Just Transition Alliance should engage with Chapter 0, which is doing a very big job of engaging with boards in the UK around bringing awareness around TCFD. The TCFD announcement will absolutely catalyse interest at board level. And we know that although 2025 is the mandatory deadline, elements are going to be introduced in 2023, which is not a long time frame. So board level education, employee education. I mean, employees can be a fantastic source of change and drive within a good company. The area, so I think all of this has been brilliant. The thing that worries me most is actually what Rachel said about the lack of Indigenous skills. You know, we have a hugely service-based economy. Over 60% of private sector jobs are in SMEs. It's a vital contributor to our economy and to our restarting. I really do think if we could engage with government and with industry sectors to say, these are the skills that are going to be in critically short supply. This is where we need to encourage R&D, innovation and spend. I think that would be really powerful because that's where we can find not just jobs, but skills and valuable work. And I think the UK has got a passion for digital, and I think that's great. We want to be a digital leader. It's got a passion for certain other industries, including investment as it happens. I think we should have a passion for elements of this renewal agenda so that we want to be the global leaders in this. And I think some really serious thought, engaging with BEIS, engaging with other commissions that are looking at green jobs is absolutely vital for the Just Transition Alliance.
Brilliant. Well, that's really good. So I think thanks to everyone who who's come and joined this conversation, and to the 40 members of the Alliance, many of you online. I couldn't sort of take all of you, and I didn't want to shock you into speaking, but thanks for speaking, Bill and Faith and Bruce, and thanks to the panelists as well. So I think some really important points. I think we have potential now. We have recognition of the vital nature of the just transition as part of delivering net zero, and also part of our recovery. I think the point you were making there about skills, and I think also echoed by many people, is important. There is a green jobs task force, and I think it'd be interesting to see what is the role of finance, of investors and banks, also signaling the sort of thing that they're not going to be the people necessarily with the green job skills, but actually they could be sort of signaling what they need to see. This element of place came up a lot, I think, both in terms of the sort of local financing, Bruce, which you were talking about, the role of local financial institutions, and also the role of sort of national and international organizations like large banks and how they can respond to local needs. So that's clearly going to be a major priority for us, not least through the Place-Based Climate Action Network. I think we've seen today a very productive example of investor and company dialogue, and I think that's really, we want to see much more of that. And it'd be really good to see, I don't know, all UK-based utilities have a just transition strategy by the time of COP. I think that's entirely achievable, and maybe also, as you were pointing to, Rachel, also within the oil and gas sector, which clearly is in a lot of distress at the moment because of the COVID crisis. And I think the way you ended it, Elizabeth, was really good. That we want to be a global leader in this renewal, and I think we can do that. That's something to aim for. So thank you very much. Thanks everyone for joining. And the next step is to do the work. So we'll be in touch with you about let's do the work. Thanks so much. Good night.